It's arguably the most historic rivalry in college football. Nothing embodies the spirit of the inter-service relationship among the U.S. Armed Forces better than the Army-Navy game. Played over 120 times, the United States Military Academy's gridiron matchup with the United States Naval Academy occurs at the end of the regular season but before the postseason. College football gives it its own day. But how did that happen? In a sport with blue bloods like Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, and Georgia, how does this rivalry between the Black Knights and Midshipmen stand out? Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the entire history of the Army-Navy rivalry. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. The Army-Navy game began in 1890, when Navy, which had fielded a football team for over a decade to that point, challenged Army, which didn't yet have a football program, to a game, and Army accepted. This was within the context of a friendly rivalry between the two branches of the military that had significantly evolved and improved since the end of the Civil War. To truly tell the story of the rivalry, we have to talk about the rivalry between the branches. That's where it all begins. Inter-service rivalries between branches of the armed forces goes all the way back to when the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps were established in 1775. That continued with the establishment of the Coast Guard in 1790, the re-establishment of the Marine Corps in 1798 after it initially disbanded, and of course the Air Force in 1947 and the Space Force in 2019. It's not just a friendly rivalry over which branch is better, but it's a rivalry over the allocation of federal funding and designation of missions. In the 19th century, that rivalry would only grow as the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard all established academies. The Army and Navy rivalry, though, was the most bitter since those were established first in 1802 and 1845 respectively. At the time, the relationship was extremely bitter, so much so that the infighting oftentimes sabotaged U.S. war efforts, and that came to a head during the Civil War. Since both sides fought over resources and the right strategy to win, they oftentimes outright refused to support each other's missions in blatant attempts at sabotage. This all got really bad in May of 1862 at the Battle of Drury's Bluff, where 4 Union Navy warships sailed up the James River to test the defenses of the Confederate capital Richmond, but was forced to turn back after attacks from the Confederate base Fort Darling at Drury's Bluff, which overlooks the river about 90 feet up in Chesterfield County, just south of Richmond in Virginia. A land assault by the Army could have made this possible and resulted in the Union capturing Richmond, which was the goal at the time and was all part of the Peninsula Campaign. But the Army refused, largely out of pride because it resented having to divert funds away from its own missions to support a naval operation. To be fair, U.S. Army Commanding General George McClellan was the one who refused the support, and he is arguably the second worst general in U.S. history, so it could be about his utter incompetence rather than the rivalry, but either way, it solidified the resentment. That didn't improve after Abraham Lincoln demoted McClellan for the failed campaign and replaced him with Henry Halleck, since Halleck also resented the Navy and was even jealous of other successful Army officers. In April of 1863, the Union Navy failed to capture Charleston, South Carolina in the Battle of Charleston Harbor because Halleck refused to commit troops for a land assault. But the tide of the relationship was turning thanks to Ulysses S. Grant out west. Dating back to the war's beginning as a colonel of the 21st Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment, Grant understood that winning the war would require a deep partnership with the Navy. So while the infighting was costing the Union on the Eastern Front, the partnership between the two in the West resulted in Grant churning out a string of W's that was more impressive than Navy's 14-game winning streak over Army from 2002 to 2015. Grant was promoted from colonel to brigadier general to major general, racking up wins for the Union at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh in Tennessee in 1862, Vicksburg in Mississippi during a campaign from 1862 to 1863, and Chattanooga, Tennessee in the fall of 1863. In all of those, Grant's understanding of the art of cooperation paid off, as he relied heavily on Navy ships for supplies and military assaults along the Mississippi River in Vicksburg, Cumberland River for Fort Donelson, and Tennessee River for Shiloh, Fort Henry, and Chattanooga. This helped Union forces seize key territories in the war, and Grant was able to rely on very smart and effective naval commanders like Andrew Foote and David Dixon Porter. Eventually, Grant became General Commander of the U.S. Army, and he used this relationship to secure a decisive victory for the Union. By the end of the war, these two finally had a partnership, and the rivalry became much more friendly than bitter, a relationship only further strengthened during Grant's presidency from 1869 to 1877, even if Grant's Navy Secretary George M. Robeson and War Secretary William Belknap faced separate corruption accusations, the latter of which resulted in an impeachment in 1876. It's amidst this backdrop that the first Naval Academy football team was fielded in 1879. First-classman J.H. Robinson established it as a way to keep the baseball team in shape. They immediately took on the midshipman nickname, as Congress designated that as the official title for Navy students when the Academy was established. Another first-classman, William John Maxwell, challenged the Baltimore Athletic Club, where two of his friends played, to a game. Despite opposition from the school superintendent, Maxwell assembled the team with the full support of the Academy, where faculty even made academic exceptions for athletes to train. Obviously, that's unheard of in college football today. The Baltimore Athletic Club was made up of students who attended Princeton, Yale, Penn, and Johns Hopkins. The game, which looked a lot more like a rugby matchup back then with the rules much closer to soccer, ended in a scoreless tie on December the 11th. This was a decade after the first official college football game was played between Princeton and Rutgers. College football had grown to 18 teams since then, and this was the first year the sport had expanded outside of the Northeast, with the University of Michigan defeating Racine College in Chicago, the first game ever played in the Midwest. However, Navy didn't field a team in 1880 or 1881, as the administration refused to support the program. In 1882, second-year cadet Vaux Carter formed a team and organized a game against Baltimore-based Clifton Athletic Club, primarily made up of players from Johns Hopkins, to be played in the snow on Thanksgiving Day. Navy won 8-0, and with growing interest in the sport, along with its potential to help instill the type of discipline and camaraderie the Academy was trying to instill anyway, the administration finally decided to support it. Navy played one game every year through 1884. In 1885, they played 3 games. They played 6 in 1886, 4 in 1887, 5 in 1888, and 6 in 1889, going 14, 12, and 1 throughout the decade. Football was still growing, though, and Army hadn't yet fielded an official team. But Dennis Mahan Mikey, who was born at West Point to a prominent faculty member who had served as a breveted brigadier general for the Union in the Civil War, learned how to play the game while a student at Lawrenceville Prep School in New Jersey. After entering West Point as a student in 1888, he tried to push the Academy to sponsor the sport and was able to get the school to play one intramural football game in 1889. Mikey had friends and connections at Navy given his military background, and he exploited those to push Navy to challenge Army to a game in 1890. In response, Mikey convinced his father and several other faculty members and administration officials that the pride of West Point was at stake, which helped persuade the academic board to permit the game, with Mikey serving as captain and head coach, only on the condition that it be played at West Point. Army then raised money to cover Navy's travel expenses to New York for the game, and they named their team the Cadets, which is the name of the students at the military academy. Given the fact that they had been fielding a team for much longer, Navy naturally won this game 24-0. Legend has it that Navy players commandeered a goat from Army's quarters and used it as their mascot, pouring on the humiliation, and that this is why their mascot is a goat, although Bill the Goat, the official mascot of Navy, wasn't unveiled until 1893. Anyway, it turned out Army Superintendent John M. Wilson had some competitive fire in him, so after such an embarrassing outing, he immediately approved a rematch in Annapolis the next year and went all in on football that offseason, hiring Henry L. Williams, a halfback from Yale, the nation's premier program of the 1880s, to be the school's head coach. Williams was a protege of Walter Camp and helped co-invent the tackleback formation, integral to the classic T formation in football, which is outdated now but was revolutionary then. Applying that concept at Army, along with the more regimented training process that offseason, the Cadets were a much better team in 1891, going 4-1-1 and getting revenge on Navy with a 32-16 win in Maryland. It was a brutal end to the year for the Midshipmen, who started the season 5-0 but lost their last 2 games, first to Lafayette and then to Army. Williams left Army a year later to take over at William Penn Charter School before moving on to Minnesota in 1900, where he had his greatest success, winning 8 Big Ten titles and a national title while going 136, 33, and 11. That resulted in Mikey becoming the player coach again in 1892. Meanwhile, Navy followed the Army model and hired a Yale graduate and Walter Camp protege, Ben Crosby, to be its second head coach, and first since Vaux Carter, who was the player coach back in 1883. After an 0-2 start, Crosby led Navy on a 4-game winning streak. Army opened the 1892 season with a tie before going on a 3-game winning streak, so both were red hot entering the last game of the year. Navy came into the game as an underdog, but Crosby fanned the flames of the rivalry by telling the press he thought Navy would certainly win, and he showed how seriously he was taking the game by holding extra practices, including night practices on a lighted field unheard of at that time, and he also closed off all practices from fans and media, again unusual at that time, on the belief that Army only won the year before by studying Navy's plays. These methods paid off as Navy won 12-4. Tragically, Crosby died a month later of typhoid fever, and that combined with Mikey graduating Army left both schools in the market for a new head coach, and once again, they both hired former Yale players, Army hiring Laurie Bliss and Navy hiring John A. Hartwell. In 1893, Army entered the rivalry game 4-4 and Navy 4-3. Navy won again, this time 6-4 in a tough matchup, but the brutality of this game and its aftermath would alter the course of the rivalry. The intensity of the matchup had grown over the previous 3 years, and this was the closest of all the games, so it culminated with numerous fistfights on the field. The game is also notable for significant injuries, as Army quarterback Kirby Walker and Navy captain Red Emmerich both were knocked unconscious twice, meaning they both came back into the game after being knocked unconscious, and Walker eventually had to leave the game after being hit the second time and taken to the hospital due to a concussion. Ironically, it was perfect timing for Navy's Joseph M. Reeves, who debuted the first ever football helmet in this game after doctors told him that following several head injuries that year, another kick to his head would result in instant insanity or death. This intensity spilled over to the end of the game as well. A brigadier general in the Army and rear admiral in the Navy who attended the matchup got into a huge fight. Both had apparently gotten pretty drunk for the game, which is obviously not a tradition associated with college football at all, and nearly resulted in a duel. Yes, a duel, which was super outdated even by that time. The injuries proving a risk to service members, fighting among players and officers deemed unbecoming of these institutions, and an outbreak in gambling in college football, which obviously once again is not associated with the sport at all these days, led President Grover Cleveland's cabinet to crack down on the conditions in which these two schools could play football. Under Cleveland's direction, Navy Secretary Hillary A. Herbert and War Secretary Daniel S. Lamont issued directives to their respective academies that they can't play any more games away from home, making the Army-Navy matchup impossible. Over the next 5 years, both fielded competitive teams, with Army going 29-3 under head coaches Harmon S. Graves, George P. Dyer, and Herman Kohler, and Navy going 29-8-2 under head coaches William Wartenberg, Matthew McClung, Johnny Poe, and Bill Armstrong. However, in 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out and ended a month before the season started. It resulted in the death of both Mikey and former Navy quarterback Worth Bagley, who played in the first 3 Army-Navy matchups and was one of the stars in the game. Mikey and Bagley notably shook hands as captains of their respective teams at the end of the 1891 game. That tragedy brought both sides together and healed wounds once again, and in 1899, Teddy Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that time, pushed President William McKinley to reinstate the game. McKinley agreed on the premise that it be held at a neutral site, which ended up being Philadelphia, where it's been played 90 times in its 125-year history. The first year the rivalry resumed, an Army officer arranged for the school to borrow a mule from an ice truck as its mascot to counter Navy's goat, since mules represent perseverance, strength, toughness, and reliability, and since Army won that game 17-5, they have stuck with the mule as their mascot. 2 years later, after becoming president upon McKinley's assassination, Roosevelt attended the game himself, beginning the tradition of the president attending the Army-Navy game, and he also established the tradition of the president moving from the Army side to the Navy side at halftime to emphasize support of both teams. Several presidents since have attended at least one Army-Navy game while in the White House. Although there is no record of when the tradition specifically began, it can be assumed that many of the notable theatrical traditions associated with the rivalry took place between its resumption in 1899 and 1910, as there was early footage from then of the March On Parade, where the entire Corps of Cadets from West Point and Brigade of Midshipmen from Annapolis march in precise formation onto the football field. It's likely that the Sing Second tradition to honor the fallen emerged during this time too. That's where the losing team will sing its alma mater in front of the winning team, and then the winning team will sing its alma mater in front of the losing team. All of this is to emphasize the mutual respect the schools have for each other and the fact that they all serve the same goal, which really took shape after the Spanish-American War. At the dawn of the century, with the Gilded Age giving way to the Progressive Era, support for merit as a tool for economic mobility and policies expanding education to make a meritocracy more achievable meant getting into the service academies were among the best ways for middle and lower income people to improve their social status, making Army and Navy the most enticing schools for the best athletes in the nation. That led to both programs becoming powerhouses on the gridiron, which was becoming a more established sport after Roosevelt, now as president, got heavily involved in creating the safety measures to essentially save the game, and also creating the NCAA as a regulatory body for the sport. While both were powerhouses, they met annually, usually in Philly, in the last week of the regular season, which was around Thanksgiving, with the exception of 1909, when Army canceled the rest of its season due to the death of Cadet Eugene A. Byrd after he suffered a neck injury in the school's 9-0 loss to Harvard. The nature of them both being elite, even as independents, further intensified the rivalry. Navy notably went 10-1 under Paul Dashiell in 1905, 8-0-1 under Frank Berrien in 1910, and 6-0-3 to kick off a legendary 4-year run under Douglas Howard in 1911. Army had two perfect seasons, 9-0 in 1914 and 1916, for which they claimed national titles during a legendary 8-year non-consecutive run under Charles Dudley Daly. Dwight Eisenhower is the only president to actually play on a team in the game, as he played halfback for the Cadets in their 6-0 loss to Navy in 1912. Unfortunately, he actually didn't play in the game because he suffered a career-ending knee injury 2 weeks before. Because World War I broke out in 1917, Army and Navy were unable to field teams, causing the rivalry to go unplayed for 2 years. However, Woodrow Wilson did take steps to keep up its importance and actually fuel the rivalry with what he did. The Rose Bowl was in its early stages as the rivalry broke out. First played in 1902, the game was set up as a culmination of the Tournament of Roses, an annual New Year's Day celebration in Pasadena centered around a parade that began in 1890 to celebrate the warm January weather in Southern California. Tournament officials would attract the best team from the East Coast or Midwest to play the best team from the Midwest or West Coast a month after the regular season ended, and this became the first postseason college football game. However, after Michigan beat Stanford in a 49-0 blowout in 1902, the game was discontinued due to lack of interest. It was restored in 1916 with Washington State beating Brown and continued in 1917 with Oregon beating Penn. But with the vast majority of universities not fielding varsity programs over the next 2 years because so many of their student athletes were fighting in World War I, it was going to be hard for the tournament committee to find two teams in 1918 and 1919. Wilson, who played football for Princeton in the 1870s, the premier program for the first 60 years of the sport's existence, and who coached the sport at Wesleyan College in 1888 and 1889, shared the same love of the game Roosevelt had and understood the importance of keeping up the momentum of what was then called the Tournament of Roses football game. Football teams representing military bases had formed during those 2 years, and Wilson used his weight to get the tournament to select two of those teams to face off those 2 years in order to boost morale and patriotism. In 1918, the Mare Island Marines of the Marine Corps base at Mare Island Shipyard in Vallejo, California, beat the Camp Lewis football team that was representing the Army at Camp Lewis in Tacoma, Washington, 19-7. It was the second time Mare Island, which went 8-0 that year, beat Camp Lewis, which went 5-2-1 that year. Remember, the Marines are part of the Department of the Navy, along with the Coast Guard specifically during wartime, so this was effectively an Army-Navy matchup. Anyway, the next year, Mare Island went undefeated again but lost the Tournament of Roses game 17-0 to the Great Lakes Navy Blue Jackets, who went 7-0-2 and represented the Navy's boot camp near North Chicago, Illinois. Football as a sport returned to normal the next year, as did the rivalry, but with much more national significance. Although the war was wildly unpopular, it did fuel nationalism and patriotism unlike any war since the War of 1812, and even more so than the Civil War because this level of patriotism actually reached the South, where a greater assimilation into the Union was finally encouraged after decades of resentment over the Civil War. This led to the explosion of the New South, and part of that was the rise in football in the region, as it was largely considered a gentleman's game for Yankee elites in the North before that. Increased media exposure because of new ways to deliver content like the radio, rules changes to make the game more exciting, and the post-war economic boom that ushered in the Roaring '20s, resulting in increased interest for leisure activities like attending sporting events, all made football huge in the 1920s, and the National Football League was formed in 1920 specifically. College football grew from these things as much as Major League Baseball did. What remained unchanged during this time was the incentive structure for the best football athletes to go to the service academies. The NFL was new and not paying well, so going to school for a professional career in football made no sense. Instead, You used football to go to an elite school and get an elite education, and rising through the ranks in the Army and Navy, particularly now in a period of peacetime expansion, seemed like a very good way to build wealth, so the schools became even bigger powerhouses. That, combined with the increased post-war patriotism and the growth of the sport, made Army-Navy the premier sporting event of the year, rivaling the World Series. It culminated in the middle of the Roaring '20s. National rankings in college football were beginning around this time, and with the Tournament of Roses game being renamed the Rose Bowl in 1923, earning an invitation to that matchup was the ultimate goal for powerhouse programs, as it became the de facto national title game at a time when no national championship existed. In 1923, Navy and Army played to a scoreless tie at Polo Grounds in New York, and at 5-1-2, Navy, under Bob Falwell, received an invitation to the Rose Bowl. Army, in its first year under John McEwen, finished the year 6-2-1. Navy then tied Washington 14-all in the Rose Bowl in front of 40,000 fans, prompting the tournament committee to expand its stadium from a horseshoe to a full bowl, closing off the southern portion of the venue. But 3 years later, the rivalry reached its apex. Navy, under first-year head coach Bill Ingram, entered the rivalry game 9-0. Army, under first-year head coach Biff Jones, was 7-1, with its only loss coming to Notre Dame, 7-0. This was by far the best combined record between the two teams to this point, which made the rivalry big enough, but the events surrounding it made the game even bigger. The two teams decided this year to play the game in Chicago at Municipal Park Grand Stadium as part of an event to rename the venue Soldier Field in honor of the combat veterans who lost their lives in World War I. Everything about the game that made it big was at its peak here, and that resulted in a massive crowd, with 100 to 110,000 spectators estimated to have shown up, even though the field could only hold 74,000 seats. NBC became the first permanent national broadcasting company earlier in the year and carried this game on a national radio broadcast, making it even bigger. The two schools played to a 21-all tie. Since Alabama and Stanford were perfect that season, they both received the Rose Bowl invites, but they played to a tie in the bowl game, so some services declare Navy the national champion, which Navy claims a share of as a school to this day. In 1928 and 1929, however, the two schools didn't play each other again, this time over disagreements about player eligibility standards, specifically with the 3-year rule. Army had an existing policy that allowed cadets who had played at other colleges to still play for 3 years at West Point, but Navy wanted to go along with the rule that was commonplace in most other colleges and conferences at the time, which capped the number of years somebody could play varsity football at 3, regardless of where they played. However, in 1929, the stock market crash triggered the Great Depression, and with the economic downturn getting more severe in 1930, the schools were pushed to resume their annual matchup out of economic necessity. Yankee Stadium began hosting a series of exhibition charity games to raise money for those struggling in the Depression, including benefit baseball games that Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig played in, a major Negro League matchup in the summer of 1930 to raise money for Pullman workers, an African-American labor group devastated by the Depression, and New York University football games, including premier matchups like one against General Robert Neyland's Tennessee Volunteers in 1931. Several other charity games took place throughout the city too, most notably Knute Rockne's Notre Dame All-Stars, where he compiled the best players to play under him at Notre Dame during the school's dynastic run throughout the 20s to face the New York Football Giants at Polo Grounds. The Giants won 22-0 in case you're wondering about the chance of any college team beating an NFL team. Amidst this backdrop, proposals emerged to play the Army-Navy game at Yankee Stadium to raise money for the Salvation Army to help the jobless and homeless, and the two schools put aside their differences to resume the rivalry in 1930. As the Depression drug on, many began to join the Army as a way to get out of their current economic situation, and this fueled a dominant decade for Army, which went 68, 18, and 3 from 1930 to 1938. Navy, meanwhile, had started to increase its academic standards for admissions significantly in the 1920s, which led to a decade of mediocrity for the program in the 30s, resulting in a pretty big advantage for Army. They won 7 of 9 games in the rivalry from 1930 to 1938, and the lack of competitiveness, combined with the bad optics of creating such a public spectacle out of the rivalry while so many people were struggling, hurt its reputation. However, college football as a whole was still on the rise, as several bowl games began in the 1930s as a way for cities to get out of the Depression, following the Rose Bowl model, and the AP poll became the standard ranking service upon its debut in 1936 for college football, a reliable document to determine a national champion. In 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt forced the Army to adhere to the 3-year eligibility rule that Navy wanted a decade earlier, evening the playing field between the two schools once again, and that showed almost immediately, with Army going 3-4-2 for its first losing season since 1906 and losing to Navy 10-0 in 1939. But that year was the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Understanding that eventual US involvement in World War II was inevitable, FDR began a military buildup after Germany's invasion of Poland that was going to make both schools reach their peak of being powerhouse programs in the 1940s. Navy opened up its accessibility to elite athletes with programs like the V5 pre-flight training as part of a recruitment effort to teach elite athletes and coaches wartime skills. Both the Army and Navy lowered their mission standards, and since it was still the quickest ticket out of poverty, many of the top athletes started going there even more. They were able to lure elite coaches by offering them commissions as officers, which is how Army lured Earl Blake from Dartmouth in 1941. The schools became even more appealing after the US entered the war in December of 1941 because they were able to guarantee high school athletes that they wouldn't be drafted into service while they were playing college football for the service academies. This resulted in the rise of both programs to true prominence. Army went 5-3-2, 6-3, and 7-2-1 from 1941 to 1943, finishing number 11 in the AP poll that final year. And Navy went 7-1-1, 5-4, and 8-1 those same years, finishing number 10 in 1941 and number 4 in 1943. They beat Army all 3 times, with 1943 being the first time both teams faced off in the top 10 when the Midshipmen won 13-0. But these new rules truly took off that same year, as most teams didn't field a football program because so many of their athletes, once again, were off fighting war. Most notably, wartime rules allowed service academies to take elite football players from other schools, and the combination of that, plus the appeal they already had to high school recruits, allowed the programs to build all-star football teams. This is how Army landed fullback Doc Blanchard from North Carolina in 1944. He won the Heisman in 1945. It's also how they landed halfback Glenn Davis out of high school. He won the Heisman in 1946. The rules didn't just make Army and Navy elite, but also military training schools within those branches. The North Carolina Pre-Flight School was a branch of the Navy and fielded a team in 1942, 1943, and 1944, finishing number 4 at 8-2-1 in 1942 and going 6-2-1, including an upset at Navy in 1944. Navy was also upset by Georgia Tech that year, but they were still number 2 at the end of the year and faced 8-0 and number 1 Army. The Cadets won 23-7 to finish 9-0 and capture the national championship. 1945 saw both teams face off at number 1 and number 2 again, and this time both teams were undefeated, although Navy wasn't perfect as they entered 7-0-1 and number 2 after tying Notre Dame earlier in the year. Army was 8-0 again. This game was a December matchup in Philly for the national championship, and with World War II having ended in September of that year, the magnitude of it was through the roof. Adding to that hype was the fact that it would be the first televised Army-Navy game carried by NBC. Army won again, dominating 32-13 to capture its second straight national championship. With the end of the war brought about in 1946, Service Academy athletes returned to civilian life, depleting the roster of the military teams. However, Army's specific deferment structure and binding service commitments left their core intact. Cadets were required to sign an agreement binding them to the school after their second year to complete their junior and senior years, followed by 5 years of active duty service, and the school was not about to allow early leave or furloughs for its top football players. So in 1946, Navy fell to 1-8, while Army won its third straight national championship, going 9-0-1 and only tying Notre Dame. Despite the gap in talent though, Army had to hold on to beat Navy, only winning 21-18. Although Army won all 3 times, this period was the watershed moment for the rivalry. All the patriotism that helped it grow after the Spanish-American War and World War I was put on steroids after World War II, and the national prominence of these schools, combined with the growth of the sport, turned it into an even bigger spectacle. You had back-to-back 1 vs 2 matchups, for God's sake. Blake's reputation built by his success with the Cadets allowed Army to stay elite well into the 1950s. Although there was the Korean War, the prospect of going to play for such a well-established program during a time of peace by and large, while the NFL still wasn't paying well, enticed a lot of top talent. So Blake had top 12 finishes from 1947 through 1950, top 10 finishes from 1948 to 1950, and top 5 finishes from 1949 to 1950. He went undefeated in 1948 and perfect in 1949, and that year, he hired an up-and-comer by the name of Vince Lombardi onto his staff. Navy sputtered during this time, but they were still competitive in the rivalry. They cost Army a national title in 1948 by tying them, the only blemish on the Cadets' record. That's despite the fact that Navy entered the game 0-8 and Army entered the game 8-0. And in 1950, despite finishing the year 3-6, they shocked Army 14-2, ending a 17-game winning streak and 27-game unbeaten streak by the Cadets at that time. Army went 25-1-1 from 1948 to 1950, their only blemishes being a loss to Navy and a tie against Navy, even though Navy had a losing season all 3 years. 1950 was Navy's first year under Eddie Erdelatz, who made the program competitive throughout the 1950s, which included 7 straight winning seasons from 1952 to 1958 and 4 straight top 20 finishes from 1954 to 1957. They also made the Sugar Bowl in 1954 and Cotton Bowl in 1957, beating Ole Miss and Rice respectively. However, the NCAA allowing athletic scholarships beginning in 1951, along with off-campus recruiting, and the growth in the NFL, increasing the prospect of building wealth by making it to the league, de-incentivized players from just going to Ivy League programs or service academies for football. They could go to a state school and not have to meet the same academic standards, so this would inevitably lead to the decline of Army and Navy. Also, the schools added significant physical restrictions in the 1950s, limiting how big players can be. So as football athletes got freakishly bigger over the years, they continued to operate at a bigger and bigger disadvantage. These limitations are why both programs still run the triple option to this day. It's an effective way for smaller linemen to make a difference in the game. Still, both fielded competitive teams into the late 1950s and early 1960s, and the rivalry remained competitive too. Blake enjoyed 6 straight winning seasons from 1953 until his retirement in 1958, including 5 top 20 finishes, 2 top 10 finishes, and a top 5 finish when his final team finished number 3 by going 8-0-1 in 1958. Navy continued that success into the early 1960s under Wayne Hardin by landing a couple of guys by the name of Joe Bellino at halfback and then Roger Staubach at quarterback, who were unicorns since, despite the growth of the NFL, they still preferred the discipline and education that came with the service academy over going to a state school. Navy went 9-2 and finished number 6 and made the Orange Bowl, while Bellino won the Heisman in 1960, and they went 9-2, finished number 2 and made the Cotton Bowl in 1963, while Staubach won the Heisman. A key moment in the Army-Navy series occurred in 1963. The tragic assassination of John F. Kennedy occurred on November the 22nd, and the game was scheduled to be played on November the 30th. Officials at both schools were actually moving to cancel the game, but Jackie Kennedy, an avid Navy fan, urged them to play in honor of her late husband, so the two teams postponed the matchup until December the 7th. That game also coincided with the 22-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and wide receiver Calvin Huey, who would eventually become a doctor, coach, teacher, and businessman, became the first black player to play in the game that year. Oh, and Instant Replay made its debut in the game. Simply put, it was historic in every way. Played in front of 102,000 fans in Philly, Navy won a thriller 21-15. This is the last historically significant game of the rivalry. After the legendary 1963 game, the programs continued to decline. It was the last time until 1996 that both teams would enter the game with a winning record. However, there were still historical moments in the rivalry. After Huey in 1963, tight end Gary Richard Steele became Army's first black player in 1966 and appeared in the game, which Army won 20-7. The Air Force Academy joined in on the Service Academy rivalry with its creation in 1954 and the launch of the Air Force Falcons football program in 1955. They established their legitimacy by going 9-0-2 in 1958 and making the Cotton Bowl. So in 1959, Air Force played Army. In 1960, they played Navy, and in 1963, they played Army again. However, both Army and Navy were hesitant to play them on a home-and-home basis, partly because they didn't want to play them at such a high altitude at their home in El Paso County, Colorado. In 1965, though, they reached a deal to play Army every odd number year and Navy every even number year, playing each one once at home, once on the road, and once at a neutral site, so Army and Navy would only have to travel to Colorado once every 6 years. Then Air Force made the Sugar Bowl in 1970 and was surpassing Army and Navy as a program. So in 1972, Air Force General George B. Simler was able to successfully propose the Commander-in-Chief's Trophy, where Air Force played both schools every year, creating a round robin between the schools every season and a trophy for the team that finishes with the best record. If there's a tie in the record between all three teams, the team that held the trophy the previous year keeps it. President Richard Nixon awarded the first trophy in 1972 to Army, which beat Navy and Air Force. All three schools have played each other every year since. A trophy now at stake has certainly added intrigue to the Army-Navy rivalry, and although Air Force is now in the mix, the Army-Navy game is still the main rivalry. In 1975, the schools began their prisoner exchange program. Under the Service Academy Exchange Program, eligible upperclassmen can spend a fall semester studying at one of the other service academies. Since the game takes place toward the end of the semester, when the teams meet at midfield, the exchange students are ceremonially returned to their home side. The school still had some modest success. Navy made the Holiday Bowl in 1978, Garden State Bowl in 1980, and Liberty Bowl in 1981. Under Jim Young, Army made the Cherry Bowl in 1984, its first bowl game ever, the Peach Bowl in 1985, and the Sun Bowl in 1988. But this couldn't stop the decline of the rivalry, so despite more interest, they played the 1983 game at the Rose Bowl, much to the chagrin of Pennsylvania officials since it moved out of Philly. Both teams had a losing record that year though. Navy beat Army 42-13 in the game. 1996 did see them play with both teams having a winning record for the first time since 1963, and Army won a thriller 28-24. It was also the first time ever both teams made a bowl game in a season, Army the Independence Bowl and Navy the Aloha Bowl. Army finished that year 10-2 and in the top 25. As times continued to change, Army had to change with them, and in 1997, they broke tradition by joining a conference, the Conference USA, to get more national exposure and a more clear path to a bowl game. They began league play in 1998 and changed their name from the Cadets to the Black Knights in 1999, since that was a long-standing popular nickname for the football team. The December 1st, 2001 matchup was obviously a significant one since it came after 9/11, and Army won that game 26-17. Both teams finished the year with losing records again. Then, in 2002, Navy began the longest winning streak in the series, winning 14 straight. Army returned to being independent in 2005, but Navy joined the American Athletic Conference in 2015. Starting in the 2010s, there began to be signs of the rivalry returning to relevance. In 2009, the game moved to the second Saturday in December, the week after conference championship games, but the week before the start of bowl games, maximizing national exposure as the only college football game that day. 1 year later, both teams entered the game with a winning record for the first time since 1996. Navy won 31-17, but they did both make a bowl game for just the second time in history. Navy had been growing as a program since Paul Johnson took over in the 2000s, and Ken Niumatalolo continued that success when he took over in 2007. They had a winning record all but 2 years from 2003 to 2019. However, they fell off in the early 2020s, resulting in them replacing Niumatalolo with Brian Newberry. Army continued to struggle in the early 2010s, but finally turned a corner when they hired Jeff Monken in 2014. 2 years later, they went 8-5, and dating back to that year, they have only had a losing season once in a 10-year span. In that 8-5 season, 2016 Army finally ended its 14-year losing streak to Navy, winning 21-17. That was the first of 3 times in 4 years both teams faced off with a winning record. They had only done it twice the previous 52 years. Then in 2024, Army joined the AAC with Navy, and the two were members of the same conference for the first time in history. Army went 12-2 and won the AAC title, but they lost 31-13 to Navy the next week, and Navy went 10-3. Army entered that game in the top 25, and Navy entered the 2025 game in the top 25 at 9-2. With both teams in the same conference, this has created a bit of an issue though, as the game is still on its traditional date, the week after the conference championship games, so the AAC can't actually count the game as a conference regular season game. Entering November in 2024, there was a real possibility of Army and Navy playing in the AAC title game and then playing in their annual regular season rivalry game the next week. We don't know amidst the disorganization what the future holds for the Army-Navy rivalry, but that messiness is reaching all of college football right now. What we do know though is there will always be a place for this game in the sport, and with talent more spread out now due to NIL and the transfer portal, increased parity, and the expanded playoff may give this game a chance to be meaningful once again. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. What would you say is in store for the future of the Army-Navy rivalry? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more History Buffs Hub videos in the future.